everyone. It is Thursday, July 22nd, and welcome to the Status Check with Spivey. This is Anna Hicks, and I'm here with Mike Spivey today to answer some questions from Reddit.
Hi, Anna.
Hey, Mike. So can I ask a personal question before we start talking about admissions? Because we have a bunch of substantive stuff to go through.
Sure.
This last year and a half, obviously, has been drastically different for every person on the planet because of COVID-19. How has this period affected you as a person?
The percentage of people unaffected by that last year and a half could be determined as probably significantly less than 1%, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day. Anna and I are, just as a practical matter, are traveling together right now. So we're together in Colorado, and we were talking about how, this is the one event in my life, 49 years. And I think Anna agreed in her life, significantly less than 49 years, that, this is a worldwide, global, life-changing occurrence, the pandemic. So for me, it's actually been an opportunity, and that sounds weird, not an opportunity from a business sense, not an opportunity from any other. I've faced isolation, I've faced anxiety, but it was an opportunity to look at that isolation, look at those anxiety moments and say, what's the root cause of them? And for maybe the first time, really to deep dive inward versus we're so hinged, particularly in our 20s and 30s, on the external world, that this was a time for me to really dive into my internal world. And what I think it's done, Anna, is it's slowed me down, which is really nice. As you're getting old, you want things to slow down, right? And live in the moment. I don't get as stressed about little things nearly as much. I don't worry so much about the future or the past. It's more, how's this in the moment? And when you're living in the moment, a lot of moments are actually, despite what's going on around you globally, a lot of moments are really beautiful. And even some of I was on a hike the other day and I was kind of in an upset mood about something. And even that, I was like, I wouldn't know how great this person's doing if I didn't have this upset moment. So it's been a time of reflection. I've read a ton of self-care books from these wonderful people. We've had 3 on our podcasts, Dr. Guy Winch, Dr. Gabor Mate, and Dr. Kristen Neff. I've listened to a ton of podcasts. And if there's anything I hope that others can do when they have extra time, have a little time, right? You're going to start law school probably, if you're listening to this, in a month or a year and a month. To the extent that people can invest in themselves, that's what my last year and a half's been. I have 2 books, I'm working on. One's an admissions book, and hopefully that'll come out in the next year. We have a deal. There's a book deal. The other book is on decision-making, which my career's been in admissions. What is that decision-making? But if you're a human on this planet, what are you doing? When you're born, you have trillions of decisions to make. Some are incredibly minute. Some are incredibly life-changing moment decisions. But every one of those is going to change the path you're on. So you might as well make good ones. I'll end with this. I heard someone the other day say, and they're also 49, they're my age. They said that they're no longer working on their resume, they're working on their eulogy. And that's something that's really stuck with me. I think that's been sort of the last year. I don't want to be remembered for someone who has a business or hired people. I want to be remembered for someone who grew, who changed internally, who cared about other people, and left their mark on a few other people, hopefully.
I think that's great advice. Talking about how the pandemic has changed things, how has this period of time affected law school admissions?
Yeah, so clearly, and we've talked about this, if you want the nuanced, wonky talk, it's just a week old.
Yeah, our last episode.
Right. So clearly it's been the most difficult, probably, admission cycle ever. We go into the reasons why. It's not just because of an increase in applications, but also because of the number of people at the high ends of the LSAT are up at levels we've never close to seen before, percentage-wise. And when you're up at the top, that trickles down and makes everything harder. If you have a 170 and normally you'd be admitted to a top 14 school and you weren't, let's not even talk about the top schools. Let's talk about schools 15 to 30. Those schools are getting a lot more people with really high numbers. Not only is it more competitive at the tip top, but that has a bleed down effect to every law school. So this is a more competitive cycle, obviously, but it's also beyond any scope. And this hits back to the first question. It's been a more anxious and nerve-wracking cycle for completely understandable reasons. It's just a more edgy society. What's interesting is I had a dog before COVID. And as you know, that dog passed away. Bear was her name. And now I just have a dog post-COVID, Loki. Same kind of dog. They look the same. I used to walk bare on these trails off a leash pre-COVID. People would smile and be pleasant. And now I walk low-key off leash post-COVID, and people snap at me, "What's your dog doing off leash?" Even if my dog's like 100 yards away from them.
And this isn't a place where walking your dog off leash is allowed.
So not only has the admission cycle changed, it's changed people, and people are still, I'm not an expert on any of this stuff, but the mood hasn't dampened down yet. And you see that reflected in so many areas, including legal education, that I think that admissions this cycle is going to be just as stressful as last cycle, even if it's not quite as competitive. I think it's going to be slower than the last cycle, and I think people are going to be edgy. I think a lot of, I don't know how to say this. Again, I'm not judging. I think there's people who don't want to go back into the office. So admissions officers are going to have to go back into an office. They're going to be a little edgier. Again, I'm not faulting them. You and I have the great luxury of not having to do that. So if I want to turn this into admissions advice, admissions is always about differentiation. That's the one word. To the extent you as an applicant can remain calm, cool, and collected, I think more than any admission cycle I've ever seen, you as an applicant are going to stand out as a professional. Even if the professional on the other end isn't being calm, cool, and collected, that's even more to your advantage. You'll take their nervous system and dampen it down a little bit. They'll be in a better mood. So look, on any given day, you might not be thriving. Fake it, because it's going to have good outcomes for you in the admission cycle. And if you are thriving, that's the day you want to call schools, visit schools, etc. Now you can visit schools again. Put on your best, happiest face, I guess is my point, because the world needs that right now.
That's something that we have talked about, not in relation to this cycle in particular, but we've talked about in the past in our podcast about applicants who overperform their numbers. You've talked a lot about people who are upbeat and enthusiastic and ultimately calm and accepting of how this process is going to go, how those are the applicants who often overperform their numbers. And it sounds like you're saying that's going to be even more differentiated this cycle and probably last cycle also, when people are just so amped up and so anxious and there's so much going on. Would you say that's fair?
Very fair. I would say that the podcast we did with the applicant that got into essentially every school, I believe, but Yale, that she applied to, even though she wasn't above their medians, and who was going to Stanford Law School, that podcast will reflect how calm and professional she was.
Yeah.
We have a blog about all the things that have stand out, the 200 and something years of our firm. To be clear, I'm not 200 and something years old. We have 200 something years admissions experience amongst all our consultants, law school admissions experience, and we have a blog about what amongst all the consultants stands out, and one of those is likability, professionalism. And I think what's really going to stand out, Anna, is I don't think people realize how red flag-esque some things can be. If you call a school on a Monday, you call the school on a Tuesday, you call the school on a Wednesday and a Thursday, then you stand out as a red flag. If you're sitting there online doxing the heck out of yourself, I have 2 podcasts on all the reasons why that can really harm you. And I think people are going to latch onto those red flags maybe this cycle more than ever. What's the opposite of a red flag? Well, I guess technically it would be a green flag. But the opposite of a red flag is going to be someone who's just like taking this all in stride. I know it's difficult, and myself included. Some days we have to fake it. But the more that you can take this cycle in stride in an upbeat manner, the better your results are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a bunch of questions from Reddit that we're going to answer. We have a number that are specific to this upcoming cycle and all of the unusual variables that go into that. But I want to start with questions that could apply to any cycle. So if you're listening to this podcast 3 years in the future or whenever it might be, these are going to apply to sort of any cycle equally. First, we had someone ask, they're an international student, and they've seen on these predictor websites, sort of the ones where you input your LSAT and your GPA and then a number of other sort of concrete factors, and then it spits out percentages that you'll be able to potentially get into various schools. This international student has seen on these predictor websites that international students in general perform worse in admissions than applicants from the United States. And they asked, why is that the case?
So there's 2 components there. There's the predictor site component, and then there's the international component. So I'm actually going to break those down into separate sort of questions. If anyone's listened to me before, or to a decent extent, you've heard me say, like, I'm not a fan of these predictor sites. As a business person, if I had a business mindset, we would put one up on our site tomorrow. They're clickbait. They drive huge amounts of traffic.
Yeah.
Right. So why don't I do that? Well, I think that they can be psychologically very problematic for applicants. And if some website, I don't care what the website is, says you have an 80% chance, that 80% looks like a hard concrete number.
Yeah.
But it's in no way reflective of you. You might have a 20 to a 99% chance. So it's a false positive or a false negative in some cases. It's a wrong number, but that's masked. It's a wolf in sheep's clothes. It's masked as an absolute number, and it's a wrong number. Let me give you an analogy. I don't say to my doctor, hey, Dr. So-and-so, I'm 5'9", 165 pounds, and I can run a mile in 6 minutes. Chance me, right? And he doesn't say 87 years old. That would be like really harmful, and he wouldn't do that. And in fact, if I suspect, tell me if I'm wrong on it, maybe he would get in trouble if he were to say something like that. It's no different. Look, numbers are obviously important, okay? The LSAT's the most important number still so far. That might change, but right now it's the most important number in admissions, the most important element in admissions. Your UGPA is the second most important element in admissions. But number inputted by a small percentage of applicants from past cycles, so many people who applied this cycle got hit by this. Inputted data, self-selected biased data from past cycles is in no way a strong predictor of the current cycle. And let's pretend in a fantasy world, even though this is not the case, let's pretend that every cycle was exactly the same competitive-wise. That data still wouldn't be that great because it doesn't get into when I'm talking to my doctor, he's asking me an hour's worth of questions. And he's getting the full picture. When someone wants me to chance them, and this happens every single day of my life, if they give me an LSAT and a GPA, there's so much I don't know about them that my chances are going to be off. The more I learn about them, you started an elephant refugee camp in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. So to begin with, maybe international applicants don't do as well, maybe not. I don't think any predictor site's going to tell you that. So what would be reasons why international applicants might not do better? It's tricky because I've seen international applicants actually hit home runs where if they weren't international, they wouldn't have been admitted.
Oh,
right?
For sure.
Right. Their cultural experience, their life experience, et cetera, had them differentiating the application process. But there might be scenarios where the admissions office would deem, this person's broad spectrum opportunities of employment because of the ability to obtain visas for some employers is compromised or diminished, I should say. And particularly if the data the person on Reddit was speaking about was from this past cycle, the admissions office might say, how are they going to make it here? So in a yield protection kind of form that might be held a little bit against them subconsciously. The way you overcome all of that is you show sincere interest in the school, sincere ability to sort of go to that school, which incidentally is no different from non-international applicants. Schools want to know that you were interested in their school, that you're going to show up as a matriculant.
Yeah. So I have a follow-up question to that, specifically the part about predictor websites. So if you're an applicant and you're trying to figure out what is my school list, where should I be applying? If you, Mike Spivey, are saying you should not be using these predictor websites or you should not be putting too much emphasis on them, how would you be choosing your school list?
That's a really good question. Obviously, you want to apply, if you have the means, to reach schools, target schools, and safety schools. That's it. I even hate saying that because it's just admissions 101, but
Sure.
Let's pretend that there's someone out there who hasn't thought in those terms. I mean, you don't need a predictor site to do this, but you could. Reach schools would be sort of, above your medians, which this is going to be the most interesting cycle ever because the medians this cycle are going to be so up that some schools are actually going to probably be realistic and say, if we're going to bring in the same class size and the LSAT isn't skewed way 165 and above, we're not going to set our target. Usually we say, take a look at the medians and add +1. That's that school's target. This year, that might not be the case. But either way, when you're looking at your spectra, +1, +2, LSAT above, +3, LSAT above, depending on if you're a splitter or not, or super splitter or not, and you can define those maybe later on. But yeah, those are your reach schools. You don't need a predictor site for that. And then your target schools are right around where you scored your GPA and your median, if that school's LSAT's right around. And then your safeties, and you don't need to overdo safeties because they generally don't give you much scholarship negotiation leverage. You're going to be above both their medians. You're probably going to get a full ride at those schools. So, thinking in those terms, it looks like I'm going to be definitely below their medians. That's a reach, but I love the school. I should like really double click on that, but I love the school, right? That's another way to pick what schools you apply to. It's
Right.
not, I'll never forget the number of people who, when I was in admissions, who came up to my table because we used to do these forums and they would be carrying around the U.S. News World Report top 20 law school list or whatever. And they would just be going from school 1 to school 20 without knowing anything about the schools. That's the worst way to pick a law school. I bet you there's not a single hiring partner out there that could accurately name at a big law firm the top 20 law schools. Maybe there's like, I hate absolutes. Maybe there's like 1 or 2. Find schools you're drawn to for personal reasons, then find that range of schools, and that's a good way to pick the schools you're applying to. Obviously, this coming cycle, if possible, the more the better. I usually tell people 7 to 9 schools is a good number. To me, 9 to 15 this coming cycle, because we have no idea if this cycle is going to be really competitive or if it's going to go freaking south and it's going to be just as competitive as this past cycle because of the number of reapplicants and deferrals, which would make it historically level competitive. The greater number of schools you can apply to, the better. Don't be afraid to ask for fee waivers.
2 notes on that. First, you mentioned that big law partners probably can't name the top 20 law schools accurately. Just to, in your words, double click on that. We actually interviewed Jeff Chapman, who is Rainmaker. I mean, Mike, you know this. I'm just telling our listeners, who is sort of a Rainmaker M&A partner at Gibson Dunn, which is a prominent big law firm. And he couldn't even name the top 6 law schools accurately.
I was actually surprised that he was as close as he was.
Yeah, he
so
got
to
5
me, it was
out
like
of 6.
to me, it was a feather in his cap. I think a lot of people wouldn't even get 5 out of 6 of the top 6.
And then the second thing is you mentioned splitters. I just want to define that for anyone who might be new to the law school application process and might not know what a splitter is. Basically, a splitter is someone who is applying to a given law school and they are above their LSAT median but below their GPA median, typically by, a few points. People will call them a quote-unquote super splitter if you have a super high LSAT versus a super low GPA. And if you ever hear the term a quote-unquote reverse splitter, that's someone who's the opposite. So lower LSAT, higher GPA than the medians of the given school that they're applying to.
One final thing about that. People will say, well, the top 20 schools, I'm looking at their employment data. I'm looking at law school transparency or ABA 509s.
Great sources of data. For sure.
Wonderful way to look at employment data, but also I just wouldn't live in the moment because that, a new dean of career services, et cetera. If you look at like the University of Florida 4 years ago versus now, it's the 47th school versus the 21st school, they're obviously getting more attention from employers. So when you are applying to law school, that's 4 years removed from the employment data, or 3 years removed from when you'll be graduating, at least 3 to 4 years. So those numbers are very good starting points, but they're not end points. My point being this: if one school has an 80% employment at graduation and another has a 75, that's like, to me, 4 years down the road, that could flip
easily,
right on a dime.
So I have a couple of questions moving to the next thing. And this is a question from Reddit. Some application forms ask if you have received assistance writing your application materials.
Yeah, 3.
Yeah, and if you paid for them. How would you say schools view applicants that say that they used paid consulting services? And I know you said there are only 3.
So there's 3 that we know of. Maybe there'll be 4 next year. They used to do something similar many, many years ago as far as like, does your school have a pre-law advisor when pre-law advisors were new?
I didn't know that.
I don't know if they asked it on the application, but it was like not a commonly applauded, appreciated thing. Now I'm going back 54, 60 years. And over time, it became more and more common and more accepted. And now not only does no one say, did you have help from a pre-law advisor, law schools go to conferences with pre-law advisors.
Right.
As you know, on it next week, I'm speaking at a conference for pre-law advisors.
Yeah.
So I think that question becomes less significant as far as like, I don't think it's going to help you. To be fair, there are so many bad actors in our industry. I could see a scenario where a lot of admissions consultants would say, oh, that's a good thing. Well, no, it's not a correct thing. It's like, it's not a plus on the scale. I just don't see it as a minus on the scale. The 3 schools that we know of that ask that question, I wouldn't say, I have the data, that we get clients into those schools every year. So I wouldn't over worry about it if you're using an admissions consultant, and not just us, but any admissions consultant. I wouldn't overthink it. I would certainly just give a sincere answer. Here's a good example. I have a really busy job. I have no time to understand the admissions process. I don't even know what these words mean. So I'm using an admissions consultant because I literally don't have the time that maybe some other people do to sort of do a deep dive into the research of admissions. Now, I can't see it. I mean, I know a lot of admissions deans. I know a lot of admissions committee members. I don't see a single one that would hold that against the applicant.
So we have a couple of questions also about personal statements. First, could you weigh in on having your personal statement not mention specifically your interest in law? And the person who asked this on Reddit noted, especially for people who have sort of very classic law school resumes, government or paralegal work, maybe a pre-law organization on their resume from undergrad, maybe they're a political science major, but also just in general, how do you feel about mentioning or not mentioning, discussing or not discussing your interest in law specifically in your personal statement?
Right. As you know, I think, Anna, my all-time favorite personal statement, which is on my personal website, spiveyblog.com, it never mentions law school, reasons to go to law school, interest in law school. At first glance, if you were to read it quickly, it doesn't even seem like it's about the applicant, although the underlying theme is all about the applicant and sort of internal discovery and internal growth. What I would say is this, as a heuristic, if you have really sincere reasons, sincere experience, sincere background that draws you to law school, it's probably a good idea to bring that up somewhere in your personal statement. People laugh at our firm, but that Jazzy the cat applicant got into every law school she applied to. And remember, her cat was taken away from her when she was like 6 or 7.
Oh, yeah,
and
I know
the lawyers came and took the cat away. And she dealt with litigation as a child because her beloved pet was taken away. This seems so trivial, but it actually was a home run. And, she thought of lawyers as these fancy people in fancy suits that used long words she didn't know. And what did that do? That motivated her to learn those words. And she was an intern at a law firm when she applied to law school and told that story. I'm not intimidated by people with fancy suits and fancy legal words now because I can use them too. So that's an incredibly easy, natural segue to why I want to be a lawyer. That's just a kind of a jazzy, no pun intended, example. But 60% of applicants might have that. There's a reason why you want to go to law school, right? And that reason might have to do with some experience you had. But if you don't have that experience, it's also perfectly fine not to mention why you want to go to law school. As a former admissions officer who's made many, many tens of thousands of admissions decisions, our default mode in admissions is that if you're applying to law school, you want to go to law school. So it's not the sine qua non of like, you have to talk about why law to get into law school, because you can sort of default that in admissions anyways. If it's sincere, go for it. If you don't have a great reason to bring it up, don't worry about it.
And that's especially true for people who have, as the Redditor asked, paralegal work or legal organizations on their resume, that sort of thing. It's pretty clear probably to admissions offices that person is interested in law school. They are not going to need to explain. And they might, as you said, if they have a sincere, compelling, interesting story and that leads to why law, then great. But if they don't, it's probably going to be pretty apparent to admissions offices regardless.
Yeah, Jazzy the cat wasn't on that person's resume, so it was a great topic. But the last thing you want to do in admissions is take 3 resume things and turn it into a personal statement.
So another question about personal statements, and perhaps a more sensitive one. If you have struggled with mental health as an applicant, is it okay to include that as an aspect of your personal statement?
I mean, it's a really tough question to answer as a binary yes, it's okay, or no, it's not okay, because in these situations, it's really important how you frame the issue at hand, the challenge at hand. Here's how I would do it. I think it's perfectly okay to talk about a challenge. It's something that's shaped who you are, something that you've overcome or that you're working on. I think it's also very important when you're talking about certain challenges to end on an upbeat, positive note so that the admissions office sort of has a positive takeaway too. I'll give you an example. We had Gabor Mate on our podcast, and he's arguably the world's leading substance abuse doctor. And I think if I were talking about an addiction, which per Dr. Mate is very much a mental health issue, it's a way to numb the pain of trauma. I've seen many hundreds, if not thousands of people write about overcoming addictions, but you wouldn't want to write about being in the throes of an addiction as you're applying to law school. I don't know how else to say it. That person probably wouldn't be admitted because the law schools would be concerned about their well-being.
Yeah, I think law schools want to make sure that the people who they admit are going to be able to do law school without harming themselves personally, mentally, emotionally.
Law school takes a toll on a lot of people. Not everyone. Yeah. Some people thrive, and I've seen the people who thrive, and it's awesome to see. But it also takes a toll on some people. So any indicator in the personal statement that is going to take an extra toll on you, I think for understandable reasons, for compassionate reasons, the admissions office might say, well, I don't want to do this to this person. But if you've overcome something, or if you're putting in a lot of work into yourself, then you might not be signaling that to the admissions office, and that's perfectly fine to write about. Let me just also add one more thing. This is just my opinion. It's my opinion based on reading lots of stuff and listening to lots of stuff. But I would argue that just about everyone has some sort of mental health challenge. Almost undeniably, everyone has some sort of trauma, whether it's a lowercase t or an uppercase t in their youth. So you're not alone. So if you're talking about this stuff, the person reading your application, at least subconscious level, can relate.
I think that's important to note. So switching gears, we also got a couple of questions about quote unquote YX statements, which for anybody who doesn't know what that is, it's basically an optional essay where you describe why you're interested in a particular law school. Do you have any advice for crafting sincere YX statements, particularly if you're not able to visit a law school and if you don't know anybody who has attended that law school?
Yeah, you've heard me do this, but I analogize it to you're doing archery.
Right, you have your target.
Send this to Peter Attia. We want him on our podcast, and he loves archery.
Oh, jeez.
Keep that in. Don't edit it out. You have the small target in the middle, and then the wider circle, and then the much wider circle. You want to hit that small circle, and that generally is, I know someone at the law school, or I've been to the law school, and these are the sincere things that stood out.
Yeah.
Right? So then the second circle would be anything that you could possibly do that doesn't show you plucked it off the internet. You talk to friends. You're a philosophy major, and your philosophy professor went to UVA law school, or anything that doesn't sound like you're just picking things apart from the internet. But then the third circle, which might be for the person that asked this question, which is still perfectly fine, it's just not as tight as the middle circles, is, okay, here's my background, and here's something about the school, whatever it is, that fits perfectly. It's a key in a lock with my background. That's a really good why statement. I am interested in human trafficking. Professor Smith gave this beautiful, now online YouTube talk on human trafficking, and the opportunity just to be in the same building with Professor Smith and ideally a research assistant makes your law school my number one choice.
Yeah.
That sounds sincere, because it is sincere.
Yeah. So even within just things that you can find on the law school's website, there's a difference between saying, I'm interested in your law school because I'm interested in this clinic and this class and this professor, versus really tying that in with things in your background, demonstrable things that you have done, organizations, employment, whatever, that you can connect and say, I have a specific interest in this, I have a demonstrable interest in this, and your law school is great at that. Those are very different than just listing things from the website.
Yeah, one way to think about YX statements is the more you're changing them for school to school, the better it probably is going to be for each school. Which is almost like the opposite of your personal statement. Your personal statement, you just want a sincere part about you. So you really shouldn't be changing it that much.
Right. I actually have another follow-up question about those YX essays, talking about that sort of second most high value part of the target. Would you recommend, just if you don't know somebody who's attended the law school that you're interested in, would you recommend just cold messaging someone on LinkedIn and saying, hey, can we talk for 10 minutes about your law school? And
I don't see a downside. I mean, unless you're being overly persistent. Remember that guy who on January 6th, that salesperson who kept sending me LinkedIn messages, and I was like, not today.
Oh, the person who sent you the same message 10 times?
Yeah. No, you're right. As long as you're being respectful of other people's time, and as long as you reaching out, understand they may not respond, right? I get people reach out to me on LinkedIn, Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, all the time. And some days I have free time, so I respond. And some days I literally am just running around like a crazy person and I don't respond.
Yeah.
So as long as you understand that, then I see no downside. And we've seen thousands of people do this. Sometimes they reach out to the head of an organization, like a Black applicant will reach out to the head of BALSA and say, how's your BALSA at that law school? And then they get to know that person. That person puts in a good word for them, and the applicant really gets to know the law school. That's a wonderful story. It may not happen for you. You might reach out to 5 people and no one respond. Every year that goes by, I think we all get a little bit busier, and email, LinkedIn, all that stuff gets a little more abusive. I find myself, this goes back to the very first question you asked me, I find myself answering less questions on Twitter and LinkedIn than I did 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. I'm kind of worn down by that stuff. So as long as you can handle the fact you might not hear from them, that's totally fine.
Now I want to move on to some questions we got on Reddit that are more specific to this upcoming cycle. In the last episode of our podcast, where you were making predictions about this next upcoming cycle with Dave Kaloran from PowerScore and with Justin Kane from our firm, you discussed a lot about how you expect next cycle to move pretty slowly relative to a normal admission cycle, and we got a few questions about that. One Reddit user asked whether you think the November LSAT is too late to apply, and someone else asked about when the perfect time to apply would be next cycle, and they specified particularly for applicants with below median LSAT scores.
So November's never been close to too late in a cycle that we predict is going to be slower than ever before. It's even more.
Definitely not too late.
So I won't just go into nuanced detail about why November is perfectly fine, but no, November's not too late. To the second question, there is no perfect time, but I think the question itself sort of fine points the fact that applicants are worried about timing, and they should be worried about putting their best foot forward. To me, the perfect time is not an arbitrary calendar date. September 19th is the best day to apply to law school. I mean, even if we were to data mine that, it would just be random. It would be noise, not signal.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I would say to any applicant is the perfect time is when you have your best possible attempt at getting into each law school you apply to. For some law schools, it might mean you're applying September 15th because you're above the medians for your safeties. And so why not launch the application September 15th? It's not going to hurt you to apply early.
Yeah, unless you're rushing your applications, rushing your personal statement to get there.
Right. But for the very same person, you might want to hold off on some other schools and retake the LSAT if you have aspirations at other schools and apply to the best possible school you can after you get a better LSAT score. That would be how I would do it. If I had a 155 and Vanderbilt was my dream school, maybe I would apply to 5 schools, but I would retake the LSAT in November or December or the following calendar year or January, and then apply to some other schools. That's exactly how I would do it. There was an article you sent me on from U.S. News and World Report, I believe. Some, quote, admissions expert, and I said earlier I'm more calm the past year, but I don't get calm when I hear these. Some, quote, admissions expert said it's better to apply early cycle with a low LSAT than later in the cycle with a higher LSAT. No, the opposite of that. Literally the opposite. Whoever said that is giving malpractice-like advice because that could be costing you hundreds of $1,000s in scholarship money in some admits you wouldn't have. So the opposite of that advice is when you should apply.
Yeah, when you have your best application that you possibly can, that's the perfect time.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what we should do, Anna? We should link my podcast on like bad advice in our show notes or whatever we call them.
Yeah, we're going to link. We've mentioned a lot of past podcasts, a lot of blogs in this episode. We're going to link all of those in the description. Another thing you discussed in the last podcast episode was re-applicants. So we expect a good number of re-applicants next year, folks who have applied in a previous cycle, probably this last cycle, but who are trying again. And we got a few questions about reapplying. So first, we know that re-applicants need to submit a new personal statement. You should not just be submitting the same personal statement to a school that you applied to last cycle. Someone asked, how different does the new personal statement need to be from the one you submitted in the prior year? And can you reuse some of the material from your prior personal statement?
So you can, but I'm going to assure you, even though a lot of people listening to this might disagree with me at face value, I'm assuring you, you don't have to. Because let's say you're 22 years old and applying to law school. You have so many things in your life history that matter to you. Not one, hundreds. Now, obviously, I know that you haven't been an admissions dean or admissions officer, so you don't know which hundreds are best. But I do know that you could sit down and think of 5 things that were pivotal things that matter to you in this world. Again, you never want to write to impress an unknown committee. By very definition, if they're unknown, how would you know how to impress them? You want to write something that is very important about you, that talks about you, reveals about you. What does Derek call them?
Moments when everything changed. MWECs. M-W-E-C.
MWECs.
That's
So
what
you
says.
definitely have more than one MWEC. It's easier for me, I'm 49, but if I were applying to law school a second cycle in a row, it would be the easiest thing in the world to find a second topic. And I actually think if you do some self-exploration, again, listening to this at face value, at first blush, you might be like, no, I had this one great topic. You have 2 great topics. You have 3, 4, 5 great topics. So ideally, you don't reuse the same or even elements of the same personal statement. If you do, it's going to kind of be, for some schools, they're going to kind of hold it against you. They're going to see the same writing and they're going to say, this person didn't take the time to self-explore and come up with a new topic.
Yeah, and as we discussed earlier, your personal statement does not need to be, and for a lot of people should not be, this is an explanation of why I want to go to law school. Because that's probably not going to change from year to year. But that doesn't need to be your personal statement topic. This is why I want to go to law school. And it certainly shouldn't be a restatement of your resume, which probably isn't going to change from year to year. But I think your point is an important one, that everybody has a couple of personal statements, has probably more than a couple, but at least 2 personal statement topics in their background that could be really excellent.
Everyone has some more wax or whatever.
Moex.
Moex in them.
So another question about reapplicants, this time for people who are also specifically retaking the LSAT before applying again. If you applied last year to a given school and you were already above their LSAT median, and maybe you were even accepted. So can you answer for if you were accepted and if you weren't accepted? So then you reapply the next year with an even higher LSAT score, again, above their median. How do you recommend addressing that with the school to avoid yield protection? And just to quickly define yield protection for anybody who might be new to this process, might not know what it is. Yield protection is basically the idea that a school will sometimes waitlist or deny, but more often waitlist, an applicant who is qualified for their law school, who has the numbers, has the background, whatever, who they would otherwise admit, because they don't think that that applicant is actually going to attend their law school for whatever reason.
Right. And the reason why that matters is because that element is part of the U.S. News selectivity measurement. And this is part of the rankings process. So there's 2 separate beasts here. There's the real beast, which is a beast, which is school X, we'll say Princeton Law School, accepted you. You know, Dean Loki of Princeton Law School signed the acceptance letter, but you didn't go, and then you retook the LSAT and you're applying again the following year and you're still applying to Princeton Law School. That is a tricky situation because what Princeton Law School is going to say is, this person's already told us no once. We don't want them to tell us no twice. It hurts our data, it hurts our numbers.
Yeah.
So ideally, you would visit that school. You don't even have to meet with someone in admissions. Ideally, you would. But if you visit the school and you kick back, I was fond of, in 2020, 2021, I was fond of Princeton Law, but I wasn't ready to go to law school. And now I am, and because of COVID, I couldn't visit schools. Now I'm visiting schools, and lo and behold, Princeton Law School I couldn't see myself anywhere else. That would help mitigate that sort of yield protect. Now, if the school didn't admit you, you're actually in a weirdly good way, and I know it doesn't sound like it, because you say to them, I'm so interested in Princeton Law that I wasn't admitted last year, so rather than going to law school, I retook the LSAT so I could better my chances at Princeton Law. That's like, candy to an admissions officer's eyes.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. We got a few questions from Reddit also that are specific about this cycle. So first, do you think that this cycle will look less kindly upon KJDs because of more competition from higher scorers? And to define KJDs, basically it's someone who went from quote unquote kindergarten all the way on through their JD, through law school. So no breaks, no gap years.
I'd like to meet the person that came up with that term.
It's funny, right? It really stuck.
Right.
Yeah. So do you think that KJDs are going to have a tougher time relative to another cycle, this cycle or this past cycle?
Well, it probably won't be. So yeah, it'll be tougher relative to like a 20-year span of cycles, but it won't probably be as tough as this past cycle where you saw, if you were a KJD, it was much more difficult because there's so many strong scorers that schools could be more, they had more opportunity to read holistically and not look just at numbers. And it'll be a little bit like that, a lot like that, but not exactly like that this cycle. So I would say in a vacuous ability to answer that question, yeah, you would rather have a year or 2 work experience. Why?
All else equal.
Yeah, all else equal. Work experience, I think Scott Moss did a study on this, but you're more apt to do a little bit better in law school. You're certainly going to answer law school admissions interview questions, probably with some work experience stories, maybe not, with a little more poise and professionalism. You're probably, but not definitely, going to answer employer interview questions with stories and a little bit more poise and professionalism. So those things all translate to maybe someone taking a little bit more of a chance on you and admitting you because of your work experience. It's not the end all be all. There's a lot of KJDs who will be admitted this upcoming cycle. But is it helpful to be non-KJD? Yes. Is it helpful this coming cycle more than a less competitive cycle? Very much so. Is
there anything in particular that KJD should do to differentiate their applications?
Yeah, I mean, if you're KJD, for the vast majority of applicants, you do have work experience. You just didn't go work full-time after college. So there's plenty of opportunities in interviews and essays, et cetera, to talk about other forms of work experience, extracurricular experience, leadership experience. All of those things show the same thing as interning at a law firm would show, or any sort of 1 year full-time employment would show. If you're KJD, you have life experience that still shows that you're very well equipped to go to law school, to talk to employers. So just highlight those things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question about this cycle: will splitters, which we defined earlier with particularly high LSATs, have an advantage this cycle potentially relative to other cycles because schools might be trying to maintain those kind of inflated LSAT scores, inflated medians from the prior cycle where we had more high scores?
That's a good question. Whoever asked that's a good question. I think the most sincere way to answer that would be people above both medians are really going to do well early because it's going to be a slow cycle. So law schools are just going to be admitting really strong applicants. And then, you see a scenario where you start getting past September, October, November, and you start seeing splitters doing well. Because, hey, I got a 169 LSAT median this year, says school X. Let's maintain it. But come February, March, April, unless that school is going to decrease their class size, they very well might look at the data and say, there's no way we're keeping the 169. And this happens so many cycles, not every cycle, but so many cycles. It's like the seesaw. It just goes, whoop, and then all of a sudden the reverse splitters start doing really well.
Right. So it might vary from school to school.
Oh, yeah. It will vary from school to school.
Yeah. I think that's all the Reddit questions that we have time for. We're running off to a plane.
Right. Yeah, let's not miss our flights.
Do you have any other sort of last thoughts, advice, anything else that you want to add?
Do I have any last thoughts? Don't do this thing on your own. And this is not me saying use an admissions consultant.
Lots of people don't need admissions consultants.
And this is not me saying put your personal statement on Reddit and ask someone who's never made an admissions decision to edit the heck out of it. What I'm saying is talk through your experiences with others. And if you want, you can reach out to our firm. And if you want to blog about your experience, maybe we'll put it up for people in the upcoming cycles. Because the thing I've learned, and this is going to go back to the very first question you asked me on it, is none of us are alone in sort of our internal dialogue.
Yeah.
So your internal dialogue this cycle might be nervous, neurotic, whatever word you want to use. You're going to feel it. But what did Gabor Mate say? You're comparing your insides with their outsides, but their insides are no different than yours, let me assure you. Something along those lines. Yeah. That is the case. So feel free to, you'll make friends on Reddit or wherever. You'll make friends applying to law school. You have friends applying to law school. I would say the more you bottle up what you're going through, the more anxious this is going to feel.
I think that's great advice to end on. Thank you, Mike, for answering all these questions. I think there's a lot of substantive admissions advice and a lot of sort of life advice sprinkled in. So thank you, Mike.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone, for the questions. And I'm going to be off the grid for 2 days, which is another part of trying to slow things down.